So Christian school governors are being urged to carefully check their school's RSE, relationship and sex education policies, ahead of their first governors' meetings, which are happening, well, I suppose, more or less now. This comes from a call from somebody who did check their policy and realised that some of the things that it was saying around relationships and attitudes towards, well, things like trans situations and trans teaching were not quite in keeping with the law. Sometimes you have to have your own convictions to prompt you to raise your head above the parapet. And it's not always a welcome thing when you do, but it is important that we stand up for what is true, and in this particular instance, stand up for what is legal. Ciarán Kelly is Deputy Director of the Christian Institute. Christian.org.uk is their website, because this wasn't just about a difference of opinion or difference of perspective, was it, Ciarán?
No, Paul, thanks for having me on. No, this was a school governor doing their job. You know, there's voluntary school governors all over the country doing great work. Is a difficult thing to do. It's a real responsibility that they have. And this was a lady. We're calling her Susan because there was a legal case when she was dismissed from the governing body for sort of questioning this policy, and the High Court is protecting her anonymity. So we're calling her Susan. That's not her real name. And essentially what she did, Paul, was she did her job. She studied this new RSE policy that her school was looking at and said, I'm not so sure about some of this. And irrespective of where you might stand on some of the contentious issues like transgenderism, this was a lady who said, I think the school might be taking on something which is unlawful. You know, the law does have something to say about how governors operate and how schools operate. And she saw this policy which was trans affirming. It used a resource called the gender bread person. It's been widely discredited, but unfortunately it's still used. And that comes out with things like biological sex is on a spectrum between 0 and 100. You can sort of choose these things. Some things we thought we left behind years ago in terms of stereotyping, that if you dress a particular way or you're more into sports or less into sports, that says something about whether you're a girl trapped in a boy's body and this sort of stuff. And she said, well, I don't think we should be using this. And she's absolutely right, because the law says that a governing body should forbid the promotion of partisan political views and the teaching of any subject. It should take steps to secure that where contentious issues are talked about, that there's a balanced view. And she essentially said, I'm not sure this is what's happening here. So she was doing her job. And for that, she was dismissed, and there was a legal case. And as a result of that, the High Court ordered her reinstatement. So from that perspective, that worked out well. But reflecting on that, Susan said, well, you know, there's lots of other people in my position. And at round about this time of year, as you suggested there, this is when schools are looking at their policies and governors are looking at their policies. And I'm not a school governor, Paul, but, you know, you talk to some of these people and there's an awful lot of paperwork.
Indeed. I remember back in the day when I was a governor, and I was chair of governors for a while as well. And I mean, this is going back a good sort of 10, 15 years. It was bad enough then. But there was a temptation, I suppose, that if the head teacher presented you with a policy, said, this is our school policy on special educational needs or on, well, any subject, you would just kind of go, oh, well, they are the professional. They know what they're talking about. I agree. And rubber stamp it. And the point that Susan's making is rubber stamping doesn't work anymore, because we've got real issues that need to be explored.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe there are some things where you've seen them before and the changes are highlighted. You know how these things work. The changes are highlighted and there's nothing really much to say. But this was a new policy on a very contentious issue. It's all over the news at the moment. The government's sort of talking about how schools need to have more guidance, and there's various MPs, the likes of Miriam Cates, to name but one, who are saying, well, you know, the government needs to get a grip of this. And Susan was essentially saying, well, I've learning from my experience, governors, particularly Christian governors, you've got a responsibility. have a look at this stuff. Don't just take it at face value. Have a little look down, because when I did that, I found that there were problems. And at the end of the day, you're protecting the school, because you don't want to be a governor of a school that's taking on unlawful policies. And that was her concern.
The fact that this school were taking on this resource that had been discredited and that perhaps was, I think the words you used was partisan in its political perspective that it was bringing. I would have thought that that would have been a responsibility for the sort of state authorities when it comes to education. Has there been any response to the fact that this was happening?
Well, that is a great question, Paul. Susan worked through a complaints process. So very, very, very briefly, she worked through a complaints process. She said, I've got some concerns. Those concerns she felt weren't really looked at properly. So she raised a complaint. That was, let's call it a level 1. That was followed up by a level 2 complaint. After that, that's when she was dismissed. But within that process, there's this option to raise a complaint to the Department for Education. So that's what she did. And their sort of workaround times on these sorts of things are supposed to be something like 15 working days, there or thereabouts. I don't want to, maybe they've changed it, but that sort of order. Well, it's been 14 months, Paul, 14 months before they responded.
Yeah.
And actually the response was inadequate, to say the least, because there's various things that they said they could address, but on the substantive point about the nature of this policy, they said, well, there's some guidance coming. And that's true, there is some guidance coming. But here's the important point. It is under existing law and under existing guidance that Susan raised her concerns. And those haven't gone away. So they're well able to address this. They don't need to wait for future guidance to tell them what they already know. I mean, this is a case of asking the Department for Education to stand up for their own policies as they exist at the moment. So it's a pretty poor response, and I mean, frankly, I would call it a fobbing off, really, that they've just tried to kick the can down the road and say it'll all be handled by this guidance instead of taking the responsibility they need to right now.
Yeah, indeed.
The guidance is important, and something will be coming, and hopefully we want it to be good guidance. We want it to be the right guidance, of course, and we want it to come soon. There's a real need for that. I think schools have been left in a bit of a limbo, but right here and right now, there is an existing safeguarding issue. If these kind of resources, these kind of policies are being used to encourage children to believe that they could be trapped in the wrong body, that's a real issue.